Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Interview Podcast. I'm Donald Grodoff, family coach with FamilyOCD.com, FocusedHealthyFamily.com, and of course, InvisibleWheelchair.com. In the Invisible Wheelchair interviews, I get the wonderful chance to interview some of the experts with obsessive compulsive disorders, professionals that treat OCD, people who are going through or have been through OCD, parents and caregivers of those suffering from OCD, and of course anyone that advocates for treatment of OCD. My goal of these interviews is to inform people on all aspects of OCD and bring about awareness of obsessive compulsive disorder. The content, information, resources, and ideas that are talked about and brought up here in these interviews are not necessarily the views and opinions of myself, Family OCD, Focused Healthy Family, and Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, and I always recommend to seek additional professional help in finding solutions for yourself. You can find out more about me at FamilyOCD.com, FocusedHealthyFamily.com, and InvisibleWheelchair.com. I am honored today to have as my guest Cathy Goldstein Mullin. She is a licensed, independent clinical social worker who specializes in treating OCD. Cathy has a private practice in Wenham, Massachusetts, as well as being a therapist at North Shore Medical Center in Salem, Massachusetts. North Shore Medical Center is part of Mass General Hospital and Partners Healthcare. She lives on Boston's North Shore and has 2 kids and a bunch of dogs. She has written and published 2 books, one on depression called If I Could Just Snap Out of It, Don't You Think I Would? A 9-month plan for smashing your depression. The other book on OCD is called From Tortured to Almost Free, a psychiatric therapist's life with obsessive compulsive disorder. This book takes readers into the brutal and very weird world of OCD. She tells her story of her struggle with OCD, followed with the story of so many others who suffer. She makes the point in the book that debunking negative underlying messages also needs to be included in the treatment of OCD. For fun, she loves to spend time with her kids and dogs, hang out anywhere near the ocean, and travel. So let's join that interview now. Well, Cathy, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm anxious to talk with you and get your perspective on OCD.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, Cathy, I always like to give my audience a little bit more of a personal view of the person I'm interviewing. What led you into becoming a psychiatric therapist?
Well, I was years ago, I was a high school teacher, and the kids used to come to me after school and they'd like pull up their chairs to my desk and they would tell me that they were pregnant or they were doing drugs or they were, getting totally drunk and smashing into trees. And I realized that, I was good at that. And I also, at the time, had a child who, was just born. And teaching wasn't really working with that. So I thought, well, we'll go into social work, into therapy, because I figured that was a good fit.
How did you get into specializing in OCD then?
I became a therapist and I specialized in mental health, just in general mental health. I wasn't going to do anything with OCD because when I was young, I had terrible OCD for many years. I refer to it as my internship. And this was during a time that very little was known about OCD. SSRIs didn't even exist right then. This was in the probably in the middle 80s at this point. Anyway, I really struggled with it greatly. Finally, in 85, I was living out in Colorado, and in 85, I came east to visit my sister, and I got working with a guy. I thought I had phobias. So I got working with a psychiatrist or a psychologist at McLean Hospital. Long story short, I worked with him for a number of years. I was very, very resistant to medication, as so many people are. And then finally, they were just on the cutting edge. They were just trying medications at the time. I went on medications, and I started to do really well. And that was the beginning of my last 25 years that I really haven't struggled with OCD. But, the pain was just, ever present, and I didn't want to deal with it at all. I was working at Mass General for Children in Salem, Mass, seeing a lot of kids. And then one day they gave me a kid who was stuck in a bathroom with a bottle of 409, and she couldn't get out because she was afraid that the poisons from the 409 had contaminated her, and if she left the bathroom, then she would contaminate her whole family and everyone would die. I felt horrible for her, but I also thought at that point, I have to do this because who knows it better than someone who lived with it. That began my work with OCD.
And I know you write in your book about your own personal experience. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what you went through with your own OCD.
Mine was, it started probably when I was 8, and just with little things. I had to line up bobby pins and things like that, so they'd be perfect on my bureau. But, I didn't know what any of that was about. When I was 18, I had gone to college. I went to the University of Maryland, and that first summer, I went to California. California was the Mecca at the time, and I went with a friend to California. Long story short, in my summer in California, I got held up at gunpoint, and it was really traumatic. But I was sort of a hippie then, and I didn't want to go to the police because God, these poor guys, maybe they were troubled or whatever. That happened. I went back from California, went back to school. Sometime that year, I was driving home to my parents' house. My parents lived in New Jersey. I was at school in Maryland, and I had a Volkswagen Bug, and I was driving on some back roads in the dark, and I passed a hitchhiker, which I had been when I got held up at gunpoint, and I passed a hitchhiker, and all of a sudden I became terrified that maybe I had hit him. The fear was so great, so intense. I kept going. This is my first real experience with it. I got to my parents' house, and I was just a complete wreck. It was horrible. I was just a complete wreck. That's how it started in a really, really bad way. And then my OCD was always about harm, somehow that I would unintentionally harm someone else. Maybe when I was driving, if I went over a bump, then I'd have to turn around and make sure there were no, dead bodies, or if I saw a rock and I didn't pick it up and it was in the road, oh my God, it could go into a car and someone could get really hurt, and that would be my fault. OCD is greatly about personal responsibility and fault, and it started like that. It was extremely, extremely painful. It stayed that way until the doctors at McLean actually taught me about OCD. This psychologist was the first person to tell me. In fact, that's who I dedicate the book to tell me that I had obsessive compulsive disorder. And they started me on an old drug. It's called imipramine, which isn't really used much anymore. All of a sudden, at the time, I was a teacher at the time, and it was an hour drive to my school. So before I could leave for work, I had to check I smoked cigarettes at the time. I had to check the cigarettes like 10 times, 20 times, make sure they were out. Check the stove repeatedly, make sure it was out. Check the wires in the house. And all of a sudden I get on this medication, and I've worked with this doctor, and I started not having to do any of that. And the relief was just incredible.
What do you consider, or what is the standard treatment for OCD?
Standard treatment for OCD, for people that have moderate to severe OCD, it's medication, because OCD is a neuropsychiatric disorder, meaning that parts of the brain do not work properly. The part of the brain that lets thoughts freely come and go gets stuck. The part of the brain that is involved in the alarm system is overactive. And the part that controls morality, guilt, and responsibility is like through the roof. Medication, which increases, they use antidepressants. There are a number of them that are approved for the treatment of OCD. And these antidepressants increase the availability of serotonin. They found out through treating depression, they didn't know it, but that, using a bit more of the antidepressant tends to reach, obsessions for a lot of people. It tends to tamper those. It tampers the incredible anxiety with it. Medication is part of it. CBT is the other part. C stands for cognitive and B for behavioral. And the cognitive part is, looking at people's thoughts. How realistic is this particular thought? How likely is it to happen? I use a technique where I have someone put a real trusted person on his or her shoulder who doesn't have OCD to check with that person, not the actual person, but I call it the shoulder buddy, to see, is that thought realistic? Is that not realistic? Because people need to learn to live as if they don't have OCD. So that's the cognitive part. And then the behavioral part, which many people, and I guess I believe is really the big part, is exposure and response prevention, where people have to, you create a hierarchy with, the people you're working with of all their obsessions and their compulsions. And then how bad is their anxiety on each of those obsessions and compulsions if they didn't do what OCD told them. And then the idea is to start at the bottom of the list, which things that might not cause them as much pain, like perhaps they have to tap everything 3 times evenly, or maybe they have to count to a certain number, or maybe they have to jump over cracks. You start with smaller things and then you work up. There's usually a hierarchy in OCD, and you work up to the things that become extremely difficult. And you get them to try and resist the things that get them to expose themselves to the things that they're afraid of, and to learn to tolerate the anxiety, to not run from the OCD. Anxiety is like a wave. It goes up, it crests, it comes down. So if you do a 15-minute time delay, the anxiety will go from a 10 to maybe a 6, a 5, a 4. But OCD work is very, very repetitive. You have to do it a lot of times to make it work. But the combination of medication and CBT is very important.
Maybe you can also explain, talking about CBT, because there's a slight difference between CBT and ERP. What I have seen or heard, and I know it kind of from personal experience, a lot of people know CBT as talk therapy. A lot of times talk therapy alone is not as good for OCD. So that's why there's a distinction between that and really ERP, is there not?
Right. Well, CBT, the type of CBT I'm talking about is very practically based. It's not, delving into one's life, although I do that because that's another part of the work. But it's really, okay, you have this particular thought that, you've touched this table and now you've been exposed to AIDS, and, oh my God, you're going to get tested another 5 times and don't believe anyone. So the CBT, the cognitive part is, okay, well, what is the likelihood of something like that?
Mm.
Have you ever read anything like that in the newspaper? I work with a lot of people that have many, many fears around AIDS and Ebola and that kind of thing. And it might be that they've picked up a paper in an AIDS clinic, or it doesn't even have to be that direct. And then they're terrified of the paper, and anywhere the paper has been is contaminated. Any clothes that might have been worn there need to be thrown out, any shoes that might have been worn there. It's looking at the reality of that situation, how likely it is, because people with OCD typically, not always, but typically know that their thinking is irrational. They just can't stop themselves from saying, what if?
And do you feel like the standard method has been successful?
In my opinion, there's a division in the world. I think right now the OCD community, in my opinion, seems to be very sort of biologically, neurologically based. These thoughts are weird thoughts. They don't mean anything. And the difference between, this is other people's belief, not mine, the difference between a person who doesn't have OCD and one with OCD is just the kind of reaction, the intense anxiety reaction to it. Studies that I have looked at, or statistics that I've looked at, say that when people do CBT medication, it's pretty common to have a 40 to 60% relief from OCD. I found with the work that I did, which went beyond that, and maybe I'm lucky, but I think it's very possible for a lot of other people. The way that my OCD remitted was almost 95, 98%. I attribute that to, adding some other features to the work.
Yeah, I understand, that one of the things that you have done is added something to the standard treatment. Explain that if you could.
As I said, right now, and I know this because when I will share my thoughts on LinkedIn or different places like that, or I tried to do a presentation at the International Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Foundation, conference. I did a proposal for them. A lot of people do not share my beliefs because there's a belief that OCD, the thoughts are just weird thoughts. Everybody gets weird thoughts. The difference is the reaction on OCD. I very much believe that OCD is a neuropsychiatric disorder. It definitely has the neurology and the biology at its root. The way that someone's OCD comes out, in my opinion, has everything to do with the life he or she has led, the underlying beliefs that he or she has. For me, for example, I had a belief when I struggled with OCD for different reasons in my life. I had a belief that I was bad. These different things that I worried about, they supported that erroneous belief. So I find that when I work with people, OCD very much speaks metaphorically, symbolically. People, have their OCD, but if you can look at where the hairy fingers of OCD point you, if you realize that the thoughts themselves mean nothing. OCD thoughts are always untrue. They don't mean a thing, okay? If you think the father who goes out and thinks he's he smiles at a little girl and thinks he's a pedophile, or the person who touches a table and believes he or she is contaminated and thus cannot enter her own apartment anymore. Those thoughts mean nothing. But if you look in a much broader sense, then you can get to some underlying beliefs like the person may have that maybe I'm bad, maybe I'm contaminated in some fashion. I'll give you an example. I worked with a woman years ago, very bright. Virtually everybody I ever worked with OCD was very bright. She was a professional. She worked in a hospital. She was an occupational therapist. She was walking in the hospital and her pocketbook rubbed against the wall or hit the wall, and there was a brown stain there. She became hysterical that brown stain might have been blood and that maybe it contained AIDS. She felt that her pocketbook was contaminated, but being her keys were in her pocketbook, she had to go in her pocketbook. So then she was contaminated. She felt her clothes were contaminated. She got to the point, when she got to her apartment, she threw her pocketbook into the middle of the living room, and then the middle of the living room was contaminated. By the time I met her, she had been walking around the periphery of her apartment. She couldn't go through the apartment. She couldn't, she was absolutely tortured. She ended up moving. She was a woman in her 30s, and she ended up moving back home, which was in my area in Boston. What I learned as I went, as we worked together, was that she had been the kid who was different from the other kids. She had been the one who wasn't into sports, who wasn't the, straight A student. Her father used to say all sorts of things to her, like, you're not like the other kids, you're weird, what's the matter with, you're missing something. So she was back living with her parents, and her father continued to do these things. He told her that he was really sorry she was there and that she was causing her mother to have a heart attack, and, she's always been a problem in the family. This theme of contamination, this underlying theme, had played out in her OCD because in her belief, there was something wrong with her. I found this over and over and over in my work with OCD. I have a kid that I worked with who needed to pick up papers off the ground and read what the paper said because there might be something essential there that, that needed to be found. Well, it turned out this kid was adopted, knew nothing about his birth family or whatever, and that was a real obsession for him. Okay, but these are the underlying things. So the actual OCD things mean nothing. but the underlying things. But the reason that I believe that people in the community get really scared when I talk about this stuff, although I try and explain what I'm saying, they think I'm going to say to someone, or they think that what I'm saying is that if someone thinks they're a pedophile, there's some truth to that, or if someone thinks, I'm not saying that at all. That means nothing. I'm saying take it, really extrapolate, go to the broad underneath, see what those underlying messages are, and see how OCD has come into play.
Sounds like they misinterpret what you're saying, really.
I think they're afraid, yeah.
Yeah. And who do you see is most affected by OCD?
OCD affects, statistics say 2 to 3% of the world. I believe it's higher than that, and a number of the doctors I work with share that perspective because, you know, I'm 45 minutes outside of Boston, and I've got an entire practice full of people with OCD. And it affects, you know, children, adolescents, and adults. And the thing that's weird is that kids suffer in the same ways that adults do. I mean, they struggle with feelings about being immoral. Stop it, Matt. Feelings about being immoral, or, you know, pictures of the. I've worked with kids that are 6 and 7 years old and that have been afraid. They've gone into their classrooms and imagined their teachers without clothes on, and then they think they're horrible people. It goes from a very young age to all the way through to the elderly.
So I actually got your book, and I've read it, and it was very good. I know a lot of what you talk about in your treatment is in the book. What was your, I don't know if I want to say purpose, but the reason for writing the book? What did you want to be able to do with your book?
Well, twofold. I wanted to show people what OCD was like, not just tell them, but show them. And I wanted to, you know, make clear the idea about that in addition to CBT, in addition to medication, if you do what I refer to as thematic therapy, look at the underlying things in your life, you're going to, I believe, have a lot more success in battling your OCD. And I wanted to give people hope.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. That's kind of my passion behind wanting to do work in this too, is that I know the place of non-hope, you know, and I think you probably do too, from having going through it yourself. I went through it with my daughter and my younger son, and there were many times of you didn't really see. I didn't see hope. I didn't know if we were going to have her back as our little girl, you know, kind of thing. So I understand that very much. Well, Cathy, this has been one very enlightening. I love what you're doing. I think it's great that you're looking at other things besides just standards, because we need that. Right now, I don't think we fully know what all the things we need to know about OCD. So the more we can do and look and delve into it. So I think it's great what you're doing. What I'd like to ask you now is, just as a final, is how best can people get a hold of you or find out more about you, find out about, you know, where to get your book?
Well, several ways. First off, I have a website that is called, it's www.thebeastofobsessivecompulsivedisorder.com. I explain an awful lot about OCD on that and treatments and so forth. My book is available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble, so people can order it from there. And in terms of, you know, people call me, and I'm fine with people just giving me, you know, a phone call. A lot of people call me even when they just have a general question. I'd be happy to give you that number or my email.
You can do both if you wish.
Okay. Well, my number, this is my private practice number, is 978-473-6078. Or people can email at Sierra, SIERRA, @hotmail.com. And, you know, I'm usually pretty good at getting back to people. So those are all good ways, you know, to get in contact with me.
Well, I know you got back with me rather quickly, so I do thank you for that. And once again, I really thank you for taking your time out today and being part of the Invisible Wheelchair podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email don@invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts, with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archive past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, FamilyOCD.com or FocusedHealthyFamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at FamilyOCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.